An Evil Eye, a novel, by Jason Goodwin. Narrated by Stephen Hoye. Copyright 2011 by Jason Goodwin. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Life is a comedy for those who think, and a tragedy for those who feel. Horace Walpole. Istanbul, 1836. The yali is made of wood, silvered by the sun, dry as tinder. As evening falls, the timbers begin to cool, beams settle, boards contract, cracks ease around the window frames, whose latticed glass flames orange with the setting sun. The Pasha's two-oared caique skims like a cormorant up the Bosporus toward it, away from Istanbul. He leans into the cushions, his back to the setting sun, and lets his mind rove idly across the water, over the surface of his ambitions and his desires. He checks himself. He is not a superstitious man, but praise and pride attract the evil eye. Certain thoughts are better left unframed. Almost guiltily he turns his head. The yali stands so beautifully at the water's edge, looking out across the Bosporus to the hills of Asia beyond. The evening meal has been taken, and he imagines the murmur of voices as his household prepares for sleep. He can almost hear the yali settling, its old bones composing themselves for the night, wooden joints creaking and crackling in the dusk. He turns his head, and puts out a hand, as if it were in his power to stop what is about to happen, as if he could fit the house in his own palm, and keep it safe. Between his outstretched fingers, the yali is ablaze. It burns so beautifully, as if a wild spirit were dashing through the rooms. A window explodes, and against the evening sky the sparks fly up like shooting stars. Galaxies twist from the staircase. Suns blaze in every room. The Pasha screams. The rowers glance back. They miss a stroke. Over the crash of falling timber and the snapping of the flames, the Pasha hears screams from the harem apartments upstairs. When the caique touches the marble stairs, the Pasha flings himself onto shore. His mouth is open, sweat rolling down his face. He races from one end of the burning house to the other, moaning. He feels the heat on his face. He can no longer hear the screams. But he hears instead someone call his name. "Fevzi Pasha! Pasha!" Two arms thrust a bundle from a window. The Pasha reaches up. The roof sags, dropping a sudden flurry of flaming shingles which spin to the ground. The Pasha leaps back. The figure at the window is gone. The window is gone. The flames are driving a firestorm. The Pasha feels the wind snatch at his cloak, drawing him back toward the yali. He cradles the bundle to his chest and stumbles away. The gate bursts open, and a crowd of men surges in with buckets, hooks, ladders, but it is far too late. As the men run by, the Pasha hears timbers break, and the sky is lit up. He does not turn back. Summer, 1839. 1. Cannon boomed across the Bosporus. White smoke, the color of morning, billowed low over the water. Sultan Mahmud II was dead. He had come to the throne of Osman as the turbaned ruler of a medieval empire, and had died in a frock-coat and a fez. In his long reign he had given the Ottoman Empire French saddles, a constitution of sorts, modern drill and percussion rifles. He had destroyed the ferocious Janissaries as an obstacle to progress, and he had lost Greece to the Greeks, and Crimea to the Russians, and Egypt to an Albanian adventurer called Mehmed Ali Pasha. He had built himself a modern palace at Besiktas, where he maintained a harem like sultans of old. The harem was in pandemonium. "You are the Kislar Aga, Ibu. You must help them to leave," Yashim said quietly. "The Sultan's harem is your domain. The Sultan has died. and the women must move on. The Kislar Aga, the master of the girls, shut his eyes and pressed his fingers against his smooth cheeks. They do not want to go, Yashim. Abdul-Masih is sultan now. Any moment he may arrive here at Besiktas, and he will bring his women. Yashim gestured to the staircase. The Kislar Aga took a deep breath and started up the stairs. You must come with me. We must get the women away. Yashim followed reluctantly as the Kislar Aga bustled through the gallery, clapping his hands. The carriages are come, ladies! To the carriages! Not one of the women paid him the slightest attention. They had spent years learning how to behave, how to speak, how to be beautiful, devoting their lives to the service of the Sultan. Now the Sultan was dead, and carriages were to take them away. They wanted to wail and scream and to mourn the Sultan, their youth, their hopes, and grab what they could while there was still time. 2. Above the gardens of the palace, in the smaller quarters reserved for the crown prince, Elif leaned at a window and watched the pigeons through the lattice. Each crump of the guns shook the heavy air and sent clouds of birds fluttering from the domes of Istanbul. From the leads of the Suleymaniye they rose high above the Golden Horn, clapping their wings from the low rotunda of Hagia Sophia, where the horn bled into the waters of the Bosporus, billowing from the domes of the Grand Bazaar, and from the single hemisphere of the Grand Mosque on Uskudar. Again and again the pigeons clattered into the sky, and then fell back. "It will not be long, Elif." Melda lay on the divan, twisting a lock of black hair between her henna'd fingers. "The Aga will call for us very soon." Elif murmured a lazy assent. She had known that the old Sultan had been about to die. Everyone knew. When he went, a day and a night before they put him in the ground. You couldn't wait longer, not in this heat. Dead, buried, and the cannons booming out to tell the world that Abdul-Masih was Sultan now. High in the sky something moved. The whirling speck caught Elif's attention. She raised her chin a fraction. She heard the distant thump of the cannon and watched the hawk drop. She saw its talons extend, and the spurt of blood and feathers as it struck. As the hawk sailed to the ground, clutching its prey, Elif saw the imperial caïque approaching from the Golden Horn. Under its fluttering canopy sat the new ruler of the empire, Abdul-Masih, 16 years old, fresh from his investiture at Ayup, at the tomb of the companion of the Prophet. She turned from the window. "Abdul-Masih has been girded with the sword of Osman," she said. She ran her hand across her stomach. "It's time we joined him, don't you think?" 3. Abdul-Masih's girls ran as a herd, sweeping past a black eunuch on the steps, across the polished marble floors, streaming up the wide, shallow staircase to the harem. At the top of the stairs the girls paused. The wailing and keening for the departed Sultan had given way to tantrums and the gnashing of teeth. Doors flew open and slammed. Women dashed in all directions. Children were running aimlessly from room to room. The black eunuchs stood about wringing their hands. Matrons bawled while slender Circassians squealed, their blonde ringlets all askew. Somebody was dragging at the curtains in a little room. Bags and boxes were piled pell-mell in the hallways. A girl sat on a box, crying into a broken mirror. Abdul-Masih's girls paused, pretending astonishment, eyebrows arched, fingers to horrified lips. "It's disgusting," Elif said. "Suyutsuz," Melda corrected her. "Undignified." Elif nodded. Undignified was better. It was a proper harem word. The harem had a language that was all its own, words and phrases that you had to learn unless you wanted to look like a novice. It went with a way of speaking that was softer and more sibilant than the street language of the ordinary Turks, grander, more easy-going. That harem lisp was like having soft hands. It showed your rank. The voice of a harem girl was like a caress. But not today. Aleph stuck with Melda, who seemed to know where she was going. 4. The Lady Talfa stepped out of the room, hand across her mouth, the sound of cannon and the screaming in her ears. She saw women sweep down the corridor, hammering at the doors, dragging at each other's clothes, and baring their teeth like wolves. A vase wobbled on its stand between two windows. As the Lady Talfa watched, a skirt brushed against the stand. A woman flung back her hand and caught the rim of the vase as it circled. It swung wide and went over with a smack, shivering to pieces on the wooden floor. Slippered feet trampled over the fragments. Two girls ran past, hand in hand, laughing. The Lady Talfa saw the color in their cheeks, the sparkle in their eyes. She stepped forward. "Who are you? Where do you think you're going?" she hissed. Aleph's head whipped around. She saw a woman in the doorway. "It's our turn now, Auntie," Aleph spat. She laughed at the shock on the older woman's face, and her pretty blue eyes narrowed. The woman was jowly and pallid, and she had lost her waist. Aleph cupped her hands beneath her breasts. "We're the pretty girls." She saw the look of hesitation on Talfa's face, and her glance shifted over Talfa's shoulder. "What's this room, Melda? What's in here?" she said, tugging at her friend's hand. But the other girl drew back impatiently. "I know where to go, Aleph. Don't waste time." Aleph shrugged. "All right, you lead." As she sped off, she half-turned her head. "Better get packing, Auntie." Talfa blinked. She had seen the carriages drawn up in the courtyard, and the women stuffing the Sultan's treasures into little bags. It was all they had, whatever they could carry off. But they could have been allowed to leave the harem in peace, with dignity. It was a serious blunder for which Ibu, the chief black eunuch, should be made to pay. The Lady Talfa gripped the doorframe as another burst of wild laughter rang down the corridor, followed by an anguished scream. 5. Aleph and Melda reached the stairs at the end of the corridor and scampered up them, giggling and breathless. At the top they had a corridor to themselves. They chose a door and burst into a room that overlooked the Bosporus. A woman was shoveling the contents of a small table into a bag. They all stared at one another. Then the woman screamed, and Melda sprang at the woman and slapped her on the cheek. "Stop that! Stop it! What are you doing with that bag?" The woman tightened her grip on the bag. "This is mine! Get out!" Melda made a grab for the bag. The woman yanked it back, and the table went over. "Now look!" Aleph snatched at the woman's scarf. Melda kept her eyes on the bag. "What's in there? What are you stealing?" They heard running footsteps in the corridor, and one of their girls put her head around the door, then withdrew it again. The woman with the bag seemed to have trouble breathing. Her eyes bulged, and her face went red. Aleph gave the scarf a last savage tug, and Melda went for the bag. The woman staggered and let it go. "It's mine," she choked. "Drop it, Auntie. If it was yours, you'd have packed it by now. Go on, get out." They shoved the woman into the corridor. She was wringing her hands, but there were two of them, and there wasn't much she could do. Melda and Aleph put their backs to the door and watched the handle rattle. After a while they heard more people running in the corridor. The handle went still. The two girls turned to each other and burst out laughing. Later they looked into the bag. It was pathetic what those women tried to carry off, right down to their coal, and half-used bottles of rose-water and little paper talismans. The woman they'd surprised had obviously thought she could get away with the coffee pot. Even if she'd been the coffee kalfa, it didn't belong to her. The rest of the stuff in the bag was almost certainly stolen, too. All that money, and she wasn't even pretty. Aleph shrugged. Those women were old, and their sultan was dead. She thought of the woman they'd frightened on the floor below. Perhaps they should have seized her room. "It's our turn now," she thought, as she examined the scarf. It wasn't even torn. But Aleph had made a serious mistake. The woman on the floor below was the Lady Talfa. She was neither particularly young nor particularly pretty, but she had no plans to leave. She took no orders from the chief black eunuch. The Lady Talfa was not one of the late Sultan Mahmud's slaves. She was his sister. New girls could come in. Her nephew Abdul-Macid could move into his new palace chambers, but for now and always this harem was her home. She stamped her foot. Where was Besmi Alam? The Sultan's mother should have been here, taking control of her son's girls, the young Valid. Talfa glared down the corridor and saw a familiar figure in a brown cloak. "Yashim," she cried, "can't you do anything? Can't you stop all this noise?" 6. Yashim ordered the halberdiers to move the baggage to the carriages. The new girls were already beginning to paw at it themselves. The soldiers moved slowly, with infinite gentleness, eyes down. The women lunged and clung to their arms. The women who served the late Sultan were to leave for Eski-Sarai, the old palace of tears, for centuries a home for the harem beauties whose Sultan had died. Some, the lucky ones maybe, would marry, entering the harem of some Ottoman officer of the guard, or a pasha of the civil bureaucracy. The rest could hope for little more than to drag out their existence behind the walls of the Palace of Tears, forgotten and ignored. Getting the luggage away made things easier. The women followed their belongings. Others, dragging their fingernails down their cheeks or cramming their things into little sacks, felt suddenly resigned to do what Yashim suggested. They were drawn to him, just as the Lady Talfa had been. They relied on him, as Ibu, the chief black eunuch, relied on him, instinctively. Against the bright plumage of the harem women, Yashim's brown cloak was modest almost to invisibility. He spoke quietly, in a room that rang with shrieks and tears. His gestures were restrained. There was a stillness in Yashim that made the women pause and listen. His low voice wearied and fascinated them, as if it carried an echo of the burdens of life. It was the voice of a man, perhaps, yet Yashim was not quite a man himself. Yashim was a eunuch. By evening the women had taken to the carriages and gone. Upstairs in her new room, Elif picked up her oud and began to play. Farther along the corridor, a pale woman reclined on her divan, shading her eyes with the back of her hand. Besmi Alam had heard the pandemonium and locked her door. She sought only peace and seclusion. At her moment of triumph, when her son returned to the palace as Sultan, Besmi Alam had a headache. 7. Yashim Effendi. The halberdier swung back the door of the gatehouse. Outside, Yashim saw a small closed carriage, with another soldier holding the door. "Please, Effendi." "Where are we going?" "We must be quick, Effendi." Yashim climbed into the cab, and the halberdier slammed the door. Yashim heard him shout something to the driver, and then, with a lurch that shot him back into the buttoned leather seat, they were off. The carriage squeaked and swayed. Yashim wound his fingers around a leather strap in the dark. The windows of the cab were tightly curtained, but he could feel the drumming of the wheels on the cobbles and the slick lurch when they left hard ground for muddier, unpaved streets. Yashim peeled a curtain aside and peered out. At first he could make nothing of the high blank walls, until the carriage veered to the right, flinging him back again, and they rolled under the high gate, which gave its name, Sublime Port, to the Ottoman government. The driver pulled on the reins, the cab's pace lessened, the door was flung open, and a young man in a Frankish uniform and cap saluted Yashim. As they bustled up the steps, the young man's sword clinked on the marble. Then they went through the front door, scurrying down corridors where anxious faces peered at them in the candlelight, where doors opened noiselessly at their approach. Yashim knew exactly where they were going. He'd been there before, to the private chamber of the Grand Vizier, the man who held the reins of the empire for his sultan's sake. The cadet threw open a door and ushered him in with a sweep of the hand. 8. A lamp was burning on a great mahogany desk. "Come." The rumble of the vizier's voice came from the divan, placed in an alcove at the far side of the room. Yashim half turned, in puzzlement. "Huzrev? Mehmed Huzrev Pasha?" As he approached the divan, he could make out a heavy figure sitting cross-legged in the half-light, wearing a Circassian shawl and a tasseled brimless cap. As the Pasha gestured to the edge of the divan, his ring caught the light. It was a sign of office, but until now Yashim had seen the ring of the Grand Vizier on someone else's hand.
"Changes, Yashim Effendi,"
the old Pasha growled, as if he had read Yashim's mind.
"A time of change."
Yashim settled on the edge of the divan. "My Pasha," he murmured. He wondered how the change had been made, what had become of Midhat Pasha. "I was detained at the palace. I offer you my congratulations." Huzrev fixed him with a weary stare. His voice was very deep, almost a whisper.
"The Sultan is very young."
"We must be grateful that he can draw upon your experience," Yashim replied politely. The old Pasha grunted. He pressed his fingertips together in front of his face, brushing his mustache.
"And at the palace?"
Sultan Mahmud's women were slow to leave. Yashim bit his lip. It was not what he should have said. Not when Huzrev himself had moved so fast. Perhaps Huzrev Pasha thought the same, because he gave a dismissive snort and slid a sheet of paper across the divan.
"Report from the governor of Chalki. A dead man in the cistern of the monastery."
"Who was he?" The Pasha shrugged.
"Nobody seems to know."
"But he was killed?"
"Perhaps. Probably. I want you to find out."
"I understand, my Pasha." For the second time that day he was being asked to do someone else's job. Huzrev Pasha's heavy-lidded eyes missed little.
"Have I said anything to displease you, Yashim?"
Yashim took a deep breath. "Is it not a matter for the governor, my Pasha? The Cadi, at least?"
"Well, I sent for you if it was enough to direct the Cadi. The governor?"
Yashim heard the anger in his rumbling voice. "Forgive me, my Pasha. I spoke without thinking." To his surprise, the old vizier leaned forward and took his knee in his massive paw.
"How old are you, Yashim?"
40.
"I have seen what may happen when a sultan dies. When you were a little boy, Yashim, we thought the sky was falling on our heads. Bayraktar's janissaries stormed the Topkapi Palace. In the provinces there was fear and fighting on the streets of Istanbul. The Muslims afraid of the Greeks."
Yashim listened and said nothing.
"The city is quiet today," the old Pasha continued, "but the weather is hot, and the Sultan is young. I am a little afraid, Yashim. Men have hopes I do not yet understand. Some have demands. Between demand and threat you cannot pass a horsehair. And the state is weak. Russia, as you know, gains every day at the expense of our people. Moldavia and Wallachia are occupied by the Tsar's troops to the mouth of the Danube. Serbia rules itself with their aid. Georgia and the Armenian lands are under Russia now." He cracked his huge knuckles. "Egypt is strong. Long ago we could count on Egypt. That time is past. Mehmed Ali Pasha is not to be trusted. We are caught, Yashim, between hammer and anvil."
He picked up a pile of documents at his elbow and let them drop heavily onto the divan.
"With these I must govern this empire. I must keep the peace." He shrugged. "This is a dangerous time for all of us, Yashim, and I do not know exactly where the danger lies. Perhaps from a corpse in the Christian's well."
"I understand, my Pasha," Yashim replied. "Your eyes must be everywhere."
"If not, Yashim, they would fill with tears."
He rubbed a massive thumb and finger over the bridge of his nose.
"Tomorrow morning will be sufficient," he said.
9. Stanislaw Paluski, Polish ambassador to the Sublime Porte, put up a hand to steady his straw hat as a light wind threatened to tip it by the brim.
"This," he remarked, "is better than Therapia."
Yashim, beside him on the bench, grunted assent. When Istanbul lolled in the dog days under the summer sun, the other European ambassadors liked to retreat to their summer residencies at Therapia up the Bosporus. Only Paluski remained in town. He lacked funds. He lacked a summer residency. He lacked, in point of fact, a country. It had been Yashim's idea to invite Paluski to spend a cooling day out on the water, travelling to the island of Chalki and back. Yesterday's work in the harem had exhausted him, and the cannons booming out across the water had sounded like the blood pounding in his own head. The breeze at Marmara blew as well as the breezes of Therapia, and at a fraction of the cost. A ticket to the island could be had for a sequin, a seat on deck, a view over the water, a chance of seeing dolphins, and a glass of sweet tea into the bargain. Paluski was Polish from his tongue to his heart, and represented a country that no longer existed. At least it was not recognized by any of the Christian courts of Europe. The Ottomans sustained the notion that their old proud foe existed still. They accepted the credentials of an ambassador whose country had been swallowed by its neighbors. They even sustained the ancient custom of paying the ambassador a stipend for his maintenance, for magnanimity was the mark of a great empire, and old habits died hard. But the stipend was small, and did not stretch to summer residencies. They made perhaps an unlikely couple, Paluski and Yashim, though anyone who had seen them together on the deck of the felucca might have noticed that both in their way were conservatively dressed. Paluski's coat was well cut, in the old fashion, if slightly shabby, and his waistcoat was more colourful than the age prescribed, while Yashim's embroidered waistcoat and white pantaloons belonged to a style that was fast disappearing in the capital. Most Ottoman gentlemen followed the lead of their late sultan in adopting dress coats and tight black trousers beneath the scarlet fez. Yashim wore a fez, but it was swathed in a strip of linen some 12 feet long, which he wound tightly around his head as a turban. On his feet he wore the comfortable leather slippers that the Ottomans had always worn, before the sultan persuaded them into tight-laced boots and woolen socks. An odd couple, then, but with more in common than might have at first appeared, not least a shared desire to escape the summer heat and enjoy the breezes out to sea. The largest of the Prince's Islands advanced swiftly over the sun-pricked waters. The sails were furled one by one, the canvas slapped, the chain ran out, and soon the boat was drawn alongside the quay. The Greek sailors stepped ashore with coiled rope and lazy familiarity. A few minutes later Yashim and his old friend had exchanged the sea breeze for the equally welcome shade of the ancient limes that flanked the path up to the monastery of Christos. The air smelled of charcoal and roasted meat where the kebab vendors had set up their braziers in the shade. The cool white walls of the island houses and their ochre pan-tiled roofs peeped through the trees. Others shared their path, veiled women in long striped coats, a sailor in a shirt without a collar, a Greek priest in high canonicals, little boys on errands with bare feet, and a stout woman in a headscarf who rolled along after her donkey, its panniers stuffed with reeds. Close to the gateway of the monastery, set back from the avenue, stood a small cafe.
"Sherbet, Yash! They'll do a pear syrup here, too," Paluski suggested, steering his friend gently by the arm toward the cafe path.
Two men swerved past them, running up the hill.
"So hot,"
Paluski murmured, raising an eyebrow. Cushions were scattered on carpet spread beneath the boughs of an enormous pine, whose resinous fragrance perfumed the air. A boy in a waistcoat took their orders. He seemed distracted, glancing now and then through the trees toward the avenue of limes. "Pear, not apple," Yashim corrected him. "Pear for my friend, and coffee medium sweet for me." The two friends lay in companionable silence, watching the sky through the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?